Welcome to the Thriving Leaders podcast, where we dive into real conversations that help leaders grow, teams flourish, and organisations thrive. I'm your host, Claire Gray, Leadership and Team Facilitator at Thriving Culture. I'm also the author of Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. This podcast is filled with practical tools, tips, actions, and insights that you can immediately apply so you can lead confidently now. In Season 2 of the Thriving Leaders podcast, I'm interviewing thought leaders from around the world to pick their brains on what it takes to build a thriving team. This is helping me write my second book, Thriving Teams, which will be out later in the year in 2025. I hope you enjoy the podcast. When you hear the word data, do your eyes glaze over or do they light up? Today's guest, Dr Selena Fisk, is here to completely reframe the way we think about data. Selena is a data storytelling expert, author of I'm Not a Numbers Person, and host of the Make Data Talk podcast. She's on a mission to empower people, especially leaders, to build data-informed cultures that drive meaningful performance and real-world impact. But what I love most about Selena is that she's deeply empathetic for those of us who don't consider ourselves data people. She meets you where you're at and helps you see the data isn't just about the numbers, it's about people, purpose, and progress. So in today's conversation, we're going to explore how data can become a powerful leadership tool, not just for measurement, but for transformation. And you'll also learn how to turn numbers into stories, stories into insight, and insight into action. So welcome, Selena.
Awesome. Thanks, Claire. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Tell us a little bit about your story for those listeners who might not be familiar with the amazing work you do in data storytelling. How do you describe what you do and why does this matter so much right now?
Yeah, so I'm a data storyteller and a grounded researcher. And the grounded researcher part is really important in this world because we know that data is moving and evolving and growing and it's changing so rapidly in our organizations. So I get to learn from all the sites and the people that I work with every day, which is pretty cool. But data storytelling is helping people understand how to identify trends and insights in the data in order to be able to prioritize the most important things, identify actions that they could potentially take. But for me, the heart of it really sits with ultimately positively impacting the people that we aim to serve. Data can be a bit scary to some, it can be a bit fearful. Whereas for me, I really look at it as how do we actually use it to help our decision making? How do we use more evidence to inform what we do? And ultimately, while there are things that we need to improve, often when we see in the data, it's ultimately about bringing the best out in people for me.
And so data storytelling is probably a new concept or word that's maybe might not be familiar to many people. So what does this actually mean and how does it help us inform better decisions?
Yeah, it is relatively new. I first heard it probably in about 2018 for the first time. And I was like, it just really resonated with me. It was a real light bulb moment because I've always talked about the impact of numbers on people, the use of data to inspire and motivate action. And so I guess data storytelling has really evolved from that first time that I heard it. It's now increasingly becoming something that organizations are asking for in job ads, for example. It's in role descriptions. It's the ability to merge the human and the numbers together to tell a human story and experience and be able to act on it, like be proactive and to take action. Sometimes data storytelling is where we get up in front of an audience and we share data and communicate data with a board or a group of stakeholders, or if we're a team leader with people in our teams, there's an element of, I guess, performative data storytelling. But more often, day to day, data storytelling and most of the work I do is we're looking at our own data, our own spreadsheets, our own dashboards with our people. And it's that kind of side by side collaborative conversation that we now need to have. And I guess the reasons for that is we know the amount of data in organizations has changed massively over the last 2 decades. And 20 years ago, it was very much owned by just the IT person or the IT team, maybe the CEO and a couple of exec. And over time, we've moved through these different generations of business intelligence into this world where actually more and more employees are expected to at least be able to engage, at least at a functional level, with the numbers and be able to ask good questions and critique them. I sometimes work in that space between the analysts and the data people and the rest of the organization, because sometimes our analysts are producing reports or are building dashboards and they're getting frustrated that they're not being used. And then other people that I work with in the organization are saying, well, actually, we're not getting what we need, or we don't know how to read and interpret it. And so I kind of work at different times. My role is really different, and every day is different in my world. But sometimes it's with the analyst, sometimes it's with the rest of the team. And sometimes it's actually bringing the two groups together and kind of banging their heads together and making sure we get good data in the right ways for the right people.
So, in the work that I do, Selena, with teams, it tends to be more at a leadership team level. And it's often the leadership team has data. So, whether it's the CFO or whether it's HR or whether what those data points that they bring. But often I can find that the conversation gets quite dry and quite bogged down in the numbers and not the story behind the numbers. What are some strategies that you suggest for leaders or even business analysts when they're engaging with teams to be able to lift us out of that dry, number crunching and actually start telling the story behind the numbers?
Yeah. So I think one of the mistakes I often see people make is that they attempt to do some of the analysis and they're looking at the numbers in the meetings. The problem is that we get caught up in trying to identify trends and insights. All of us, we need different processing times to actually look at it, engage with it, to think about what we see. And what we see in data, what we identify as trends and insights differs depending on our background, biases, culture, previous experience, what we know about the context, all of that. So, if, for example, a CFO was arriving at a meeting and was sharing a report or sharing some data, not everybody in the room is necessarily going to process it in the same rate. Not everybody's going to agree on what they see. And actually, we need to be having that conversation about those discrepancies. But the problem is, as you say, we get those meetings and those conversations then get bogged down in the, well, I saw this, or I thought this was more important, or, well, what's happening with this metric? And so I really encourage anybody sharing data with, like, in a meeting, to think about doing that beforehand so that the people who are coming in actually have a good understanding of what's going on in the numbers prior to walking in. So the conversations can be more future focused or more action oriented. The other thing that I recommend that people do prior to a meeting, so if you send data beforehand, I would also, as the person sharing the data, you've got to be sharing that for a core purpose. Like, there's got to be a reason for you doing that. It's not just good enough for it to be interesting to know. If you're sharing it, it's got to be because it's actionable, it's useful, it's something that needs to be, I guess, actioned by the team, or there needs to be some thinking about what we do next. So, as well as sharing the data maybe the day before or 2 days before, the other thing I'd encourage people to do is just come up with like 2 or 3 prompting questions and get them to think of answers so that when they walk into the meeting, they're not bamboozled with all these kind of reports and numbers and wanting to know more about it. Hopefully, they're coming in with the frame of knowing what you're going to talk to them about and knowing what you want answers from them for. And that's actually where the gold is. The data storytelling piece comes in that conversation between people and about people. It's not about the numbers necessarily. I know this is a bit of a long answer, but the other thing I'll throw in there is from the CFO's perspective, or the person coming into the meeting. Like, there are absolutely going to be times where you just come in and you present something, but we've got to be really conscious of cognitive load, not overwhelming people that we're sharing the data with, and being very deliberate and discerning about what visuals we put in front of them. Do they understand the metrics to begin with? What's their data literacy? And kind of curating the experience for them. It doesn't serve anybody to just dump pages and pages of data and charts on people and expect to be able to get to an action or a productive conversation. It just doesn't happen.
I think this is the challenge. Like, often people are getting the data ready just before the meeting and don't give people enough time to digest it and reflect on it to get the different diverse perspectives. But I do like, how do you build that into your operating rhythm so that people can actually reflect? And I do like those kind of deliberate prompting questions, because I think that kind of helps bring everyone into the conversation rather than it being someone presenting and being spoken at, which I think is really important.
Yeah, and that's, I guess, in the shift of business intelligence over time, like we were talking about before, that's one of the big changes. Data used to be an event. You'd sit there and you'd listen, and it's a one-way transmission of information. And we now know that doesn't serve us. That doesn't motivate people to act. It doesn't inspire them to see what they can do and how they kind of fit into the picture. And they might play along out of compliance, but we actually want a dialogue and a conversation that really piques and sparks their curiosity. So then they're more likely to act. And we know that when people identify trends and insights in the data themselves, they're more likely to take it on and do something with it, as opposed to just being told what a trend or an insight is. But that'll takes time. So this is why it's not easy.
Yeah. Well, it's probably why you're in such high demand. How can teams know that they're focusing on the right things? There's so many different things you can measure. How do you work out what the right things are for your team to measure?
Yeah, it really comes down to what your organization values, what data you have access to, but how do you align the values and the mission and the goals of the organization with the metrics that you have? And so usually people call me and say, look, we've just got data everywhere. We don't really have a deliberate plan about what we do. And we just kind of go after the next new shiny thing. And so alignment to values is really core because every organization is different. We know that we have different aspirations. Organizations are at different times in their life cycle. And so I can't tell somebody what they should be paying attention to. I can certainly give recommendations about financial metrics or sales metrics or marketing metrics, and I can give them some suggestions. But at the end of the day, it needs to be decided within the organization. What do we value? What do we care about? And therefore, what are we going to measure and track and use in our day to day work? Big part of the work that I do is to help teams or organizations. Sometimes it's whole organizations, sometimes it's just teams, but to create a data plan. So the data plan is organized not by data type, it's organized by user. If I walk into the marketing team, or if I walk into the sales team, or if I walk in as the like human resources officer, there should be, in my mind, a bit of a plan for actually these are the metrics that we pay attention to and that we use here. And that actually allows us to kind of not get distracted by a whole lot of other things along the way. And it provides a lot of clarity for our employees. So rather than saying we want you to use data well and we want you to get better at it, it's far better to be saying, actually, here's a plan. These are the main metrics we want you to be paying attention to. And this is what we want you to do with it.
And so when you create a data plan like that, coming from a user perspective, is the intent around, or I guess what's the intent? Because I guess I think about that is if I've got a plan, as long as it's holistic so that the metrics and measurements across teams align. So we're measuring the right things. And obviously we'll be measuring different things rather than looking at data type. Because often I think with a lot of leadership teams, we actually start with data type rather than necessarily the user. So I really like to understand the rationale around that.
Yeah. So I guess the reason why I go user rather than type, and there's certainly plenty of organizations I've worked with that have done it, that way, and it's all good. What it often lacks though when you do it by data type is the way that different people in the organization use the different metrics. The way your executive team use numbers will be at a very summary level, and they will be focused on some of those key metrics that are aligned with their KPIs. If you then think about all of your team leaders and middle managers, the metrics that they use and the granularity of what they're looking at is going to be really different to what the executive team is looking at. There will be overlap, but they're looking at it at a different level. And then as an employee in a team, for example, they're going to be looking at really different things again. And I think about one of the examples I use in I'm not a numbers person is the example of, say, hotels. A KPI for a hotel might be percentage occupancy. So heads on beds, for example. Obviously, a hotel wants to be running at almost full capacity as often as possible. If I'm a cleaner in the cleaning team, I can't directly influence that occupancy rate. Even though I know that's an aspiration and a goal, the data that I might look at will be different. And I might look at the amount of time it takes me to clean different size apartments in the hotel, what time or the timeline and organization of different people around the hotel. By influencing those little pieces, I'm contributing hopefully to better customer experience and I'm playing into that bigger goal, but we're looking at really different data. Even looking at satisfaction or cleanliness ratings per person for people cleaning rooms is one useful piece of feedback for a cleaner. But at the executive level, they would just be looking at the overall cleanliness kind of satisfaction rate. We know that average within any average or really kind of summary aggregated data that sits at that executive level, there is so much variation within it. You could have cleaners that are getting 1 out of 5s, and you could have cleaners who are always getting 5 out of 5. But your overall global average might be like a 4.3. So it's the granularity. That's just kind of one example, but it's the granularity of how the different people in the organization use it in different ways. And so that's where a data plan allows you to make sure that it all aligns all the way through, but it just makes it clear who's using it and in what way.
I think that's so important because I think that creates that meaning and connection for each person to what they're focused on and how they're contributing to the bigger goal. Is there a risk then for leaders looking at this aggregate or summary reporting that they're missing the nuances and the detail to actually truly understand what's happening, and how do they overcome that?
Yeah, and I think that's where the data literacy piece comes in. And it's so important because we need our executive leaders to know the limitations, for example, of an average and be able to, I guess, ask good questions. I would want to know as an executive team in that example, like what on average are the different teams? Like maybe you have different teams organized in different wings of a hotel, for example. So you can start to then disaggregate the data by wing and by team. And then it's okay, well, if one team is really underperforming or one team is doing an exceptional job, what are the characteristics or what's the story that's happening with those two groups that make them so different? And when those good news stories come out, and then when there's exceptional performance or achievement, that's a great opportunity to celebrate that, to recognize it, and also to learn from what's going really well in that particular part of the business. And then I guess if a team's struggling and they're not going very well, then the conversation that would be then had with the team leader of that team would then be about the individuals potentially. So we've got to understand the limitations of them. It's a bit mathsy, but the other thing is in small data sets, mean or average is actually not particularly useful because it can be skewed so much by really high and really low numbers. So in any role that we're in, if we see an average result, we should be asking how many numbers are contributing to that average. Often, like when we think about house prices, particularly in Australia, we always talk about the median house price, which is the middle value of all of them when they're organized in order. So quite often when we're actually thinking about smaller data sets, we should be talking about the median rather than the average because the average can bounce around all over the place. And that's something we, it's taught in what year 5 or 6 maths, right? And it's taught in primary school, but it's something that we weren't taught it in the context that we now work in. So it's just important that that we remember those things and we can ask good questions so that we get the right numbers, but also that we know how to disaggregate it and we can get access to that information too.
Yeah, you're kind of giving me a flashback to, about 6 months ago, we reached out to everyone on our newsletter to ask how they wanted to hear from us,
Mhm.
and the percentage of people that wanted to hear from us weekly versus fortnightly versus monthly or almost like were equal. And so it was like, oh, well, we're going to be disappointing anyone based on what we do, but also you can't make everyone happy. And I noticed that even when you get feedback from facilitating or something, like sometimes feedback's helpful, but sometimes data doesn't necessarily give you an insight to be able to draw an action from too, which is interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. And sometimes it's actually just confirmation that you need to keep going with what you're doing.
Yeah.
And that's good too. If you're getting confirmation or affirmation through the data, then that's a data story. Like that's okay. What we're doing is working. Let's continue.
Yeah. So you've used the word data literacy a few times. Like, what exactly is that? I'm assuming it's understanding data, but how do teams grow and develop that skill?
Yeah. So it is obviously the ability to read and understand and interpret the metrics that we have. And there's a quote I love from a book called Proofiness How You're Being Fooled by the Numbers. And it was written by Charles Seif. And he says, nobody cares about the number five. And it's not until you put a context around the number until it takes on meaning for people. And so if we throw numbers at people and they don't have a good data literacy or they don't understand the context, those numbers are not going to take on any significance for them. And, like if I said to you, I own 5 dogs, or if I won $5 million, or I had 5 glasses of wine last night, which I didn't, but those contexts, right? You understand what they mean because you know money, drinking, having pets. But think about if we just give you fives and go, okay, you need to do something with that information and you don't understand it. It's impossible to get to the point of data storytelling. We need to, as leaders, we definitely need to think about almost the lowest common denominator and think about where are our people and how do we build capacity in them and upskill them in understanding these numbers. What I often see is that People are trained. Sometimes organizations do a really great job of building data literacy and they do some training. And I've seen teams run Excel kind of drop in sessions and upskill them even in the tech if people are creating some of their own records and monitoring some of their own data. And that's all great. And you might get to a point where you think, okay, we're going pretty well here. But then people leave, new people come into the team, the data changes, dashboards change, the visualizations change. So while there needs to be a concerted effort to build capacity and understanding in people, it's got to be a recurring thing that happens over time. Like this is about spaced practice. Like in sport, we talk about the idea of spaced practice versus massed practice and combining all the practice together and then thinking we're all good to go. It's about spacing it out. And I know with all the other competing priorities, it's one of many, many things that teams have to worry about. And equally, we're starting at a pretty low benchmark. And we're now saying, well, actually, we want most people, if not everybody in our organization, to at least engage at a functional level and be able to ask questions. We've got a pretty steep hill to climb to get there.
So, I mean, we've been using data for so long. Why is the benchmark so low? What's your hypothesis around that?
Yeah. So, in a lot of degrees, depending on obviously the industry that you're working in, for many industries, there wasn't any kind of expectation around the use of numbers or maths in those degrees, in undergraduate degrees for starters. So that's part of it. There are obviously some industries that do numbers and data phenomenally well, and or they do it phenomenally well in some aspects and not others. Whereas, yeah, we're now saying actually we're almost trying to retrofit this skill into people that didn't have this incorporated into their training. So, Claire, I'm a former teacher, a former high school maths teacher, which feels like an absolute lifetime ago. But I think I did my Bachelor of Education, I did my Master's of Education, and neither of those degrees had any data studies in it at all. Like there was no data training. This has all been learnt on the job. Like the people in that sector now are a set who were doing it really well have essentially taught themselves. It is coming into those degrees now, but we're trying to catch up. And we know that data everywhere globally has had this massive kind of exponential increase in the amount of information we have available. And I think we're just trying to catch up. But the other thing I was going to say just before is I think about healthcare and the amount of data that's used in healthcare, right? Like you get your blood test done, and we have doctors who can read and interpret all of those numbers and they take our blood pressure. And there's so much data literacy around those particular data types. And then I was working with a doctor recently who just opened his own practice. And his financial, like his understanding of budgets and hiring costs and costs of the practice and like the financial kind of viability of the whole practice. He's like, this is all brand new to me. So while
Mm.
he's very, very good at the data when it comes to one-on-one patients, that it's different metrics. So it's just, and as I said at the beginning, it's ever evolving and it's only going to get bigger and better.
Yeah. And I guess with tools and access to information, cause I almost feel like there's no shortage of data. It's more about the focus on the right things and using tools like Power BI or whatever it might be to be able to automate some data if you can. But then also there will be manual things you need to pull out because that's actually meaningful data for us to have too.
Yeah, and it goes back to the conversation we were having earlier about your vision and your values and having a plan. Like all this data that we have now, which is just everywhere, there's been like a data creep over time. Like it's just been added and added in the background. And now we just have so much. So organizations and teams that are doing this really well know exactly what they care about. They know exactly what's available and what they're choosing to ignore. We can't pay attention to everything. So it really is about that prioritizing it and going, well, actually, this is us and this is what we care about. This is what we value. And therefore, this is what we're kind of following. And as you say, it's also there's Google Looker Studio, there's Tableau, there's Power BI. It's the piece for data literacy is also the ability for people to go, actually, we're not getting the visualizations that we need. We can't get the questions that we have answered by this data. We need to look elsewhere. And there are other visualization options available than maybe the one dashboard we're logging into for that particular type of information. It's being more critical thinkers around this. Like, what do we need? What do we care about? And how do we actually get it in the best possible way that helps us?
Because I'm just thinking about my own team and we, on a weekly basis, track and report, but we've also used our CRM to track information too. And my husband, who works in the business, he is all over having data informed decision making.
Yeah.
And he's always like, "So why are you tracking that? What are you learning from this?" And I'm questioning whether we're tracking the right things. And just in the last couple of months, we've actually changed a lot of the things that we're focusing on because it was almost like a reporting on something that we weren't actually doing anything with. It was really wasn't something that mattered.
Yeah. And one of the things I often talk about is like if something's just interesting to know, then we shouldn't be tracking it. Like it's got to be that we intend to act on it if we're collecting it. Yeah. So I'm excited that you've tweaked it a little bit.
Yeah. I'll let you know how we go. I'm wanting to further automate a few things too. So I love that you talk about data informed decision making and you make a clear distinction between that and data driven decision making. Can you tell us a little bit about why it's important to differentiate between the two?
Yeah, and I fight with people all the time over this, but I'm standing my ground and data
Yeah.
informed is absolutely my thing. And data driven for me, I worked in a really data driven context and my success as a leader was literally determined by my executive team. It was based on one annual metric. And if I hit it, it was okay, you did your job. And if I didn't hit it, I would have been performance managed for the next 12 months until the next annual metric came out. I've seen the fallout of really toxic data driven cultures, data driven teams that don't care about people and humans and they're ruthlessly pursuing this number that they're trying to get in 12 months' time. It's not good for anybody. And so for me, I'm really about the human experience and the numbers as well, knowing that nothing is ever black and white. Even though we're talking about data, there is always so many contributing factors why a particular metric or value will be performing in a particular way. And it could be the season, it could be the day of the week, like it could be the economy. It's in so many contributing factors. And so to attribute a number to one person is really problematic and I think really erroneous. For me, when we're data informed, though, we use the data to inform the decisions that we make. But we also take into consideration the numbers and the quantitative and the qualitative information that we have access to and what we know about the context and the economy and the market and all of that. And we also seek out information. There might be case studies, there might be readings that we find on Forbes or McKinsey. And we're collecting all this different type of research evidence as well. And we package all of that up to inform the actions and help us make the decisions that we then make, ideally for people. So it's a very different, I'm sure you can even kind of understand, you can feel it in the words that I'm using. Like it's a much softer way of thinking about data. And it just allows for a lot more nuance and difference, and it allows for more of a dialogue. The thing I love about that Barack Obama said in his autobiography was he said, as soon as we have a target, people just play the game to try and achieve it. And that's exactly what I saw in that data driven context. Whereas data informed allows more gray, it allows more experimentation, it allows for more creativity in terms of solutions. It's not just hanging our hats on this one annual metric, for example. I think it's also, I know it's also a much harder sell to other people if you're a leader and you're like, we're going to be data driven. I heard this podcast and we're going to use data better and we want to use more evidence. And now we're going to be data driven. If you've got people in your team who are fearful of data or don't have much experience with it, that's just going to freak them out completely. Whereas if you go in saying, look, we're going to be paying more attention to our numbers, but we're also wanting to know more from you about what you know about the context. We're going to be looking at research or case studies of similar businesses, and we're going to package all that stuff up and help us make decisions. That's much, much easier to bring people on board as a leader.
It's so interesting because I feel like some people, when they take a data driven approach, it's almost justifying or validating or telling a particular story to fit what fits with the data, which is useful to them or the situation. Whereas what I'm hearing from a data informed perspective is getting multiple data points, both quantitative and qualitative,
Yeah.
maybe also research. So it's more of a discussion as a team about what the data is telling us. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, 100%. And that's the thing. When you have a target, people manipulate the data, right? So that's what happens. People will omit data. They'll do really dodgy things if they think that, say, their performance is being held or judged just on one individual metric. It's not a space that we want to play in because that actually doesn't serve anybody. It's a really toxic culture. Like I would rather use data authentically and honestly and have open conversations and collaboration rather than having people fearful that they're going to be performance managed if they kind of fail in air quotes in 9 months time or whatever it might be. So
What about for the teams? I do work with all sorts of organizations, and organizations tend to have revenue targets, especially for profit driven, but even in not profits, there's something about being sustainable and viable that's important too. And I'm stereotyping here, like sales organizations, where the key metric is revenue or sales, and they forget the other metrics too, or they're just far less important. How do you help teams get the balance right around what are the true metrics they should be focusing on?
I have a major issue with SMART goals. And I know that's probably a little bit controversial, but my issue with SMART goals is that it's often, I guess, held up by or propped up by one metric like that, for example, like a sales kind of revenue. But actually, if we want to increase revenue, I can't just wish my way to more revenue. Like I've actually got to take really tangible actions that kind of feed into this broader goal of wanting to improve it overall. So I encourage people to set really specific targets that are actionable, are achievable, are tangible and manageable, that are nested under this big kind of goal, if you like, and work towards those things. And then as we start to convert those smaller pieces and those smaller goals or the smallest targets, sorry, the cumulative effect of those is ideally more sales at the top. Like in your business and in my business, we can hope that more people are going to ring us and book us. But if we sit back and do nothing, like we can't just magically make the phone ring. We've got to go out and be proactive and actively, I guess, take charge of and track how we're engaging with people that might be already in our pipeline, like how we're showing up on social media, what advertising are we doing? Like they're the things that when collectively put together, hopefully will translate to increased sales at the
Mm.
end.
And so do you encourage teams to look at those sort of lead, mid, and lag indicators? Do you have a view about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The lag indicators are useful because they obviously tell us kind of where we're at. I guess the other thing, and almost going back to your other point, and when we set goals and if we don't achieve them, the other thing is, and I sound like a superannuation ad in Australia when I say this, but it's the whole past performance is not an indicator of future performance. So we've got to be really open to things kind of change. The lead data that we can collect along the way is vital to predict whether or not we're going to achieve those targets that we have set for 6 months' time or 12 months' time. So, the way I usually do it is I track those targets usually quarterly. You can do it more frequently, you can do it monthly. Manufacturing, it's more like weekly or daily. For me, it's generally quarterly, but absolutely the importance of those lead indicators to track that engagement along the way. That's ultimately, we're banking almost that work along the way hopefully then to tick the box on the target and then multiple targets ticked off will hopefully help us achieve the goal. So it is very black and white in my head, but the system works for me. And the problem I guess I've seen is that the employees in teams often can't see, and you kind of alluded to this before, like they can't necessarily see themselves in the overall goal. So the targets should be related to everybody in the team. So everybody's got ownership over, well, how am I contributing to that big thing that we're trying to aim for?
Yeah. And that's why I love using OKRs, which I know is a goal setting framework. So it's slightly different potentially to what we're talking about. But because the key results make you measure for each objective at least 2 to 5 things, because sometimes the things that if you only measure one thing, there's an impact on other things. And I think it then has such a balanced view of the things that you're measuring. But what I also notice is teams tend to, who might be starting on the OKR journey, and they've also got KPIs, and then there's all these things that they're measuring, and then they get mixed up between the goal setting framework and what's business as usual.
Yeah.
Do you have any sort of recommendations around how you delineate between business as usual versus some of those strategic goals that teams are working on or individuals are working on?
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to answer this well, but I guess for me, by having multiple, and this kind of goes back to the multiple pieces of data as well, like in the OKR, if you've got, say, 3 to 5 things that you're working towards, success doesn't have to be 5 out of 5. And that's the thing that I don't like about, say, a SMART goal, because a SMART goal is all or nothing. Whereas the
Mm.
targets underneath that are nested are like you might succeed in 4 out of 5. That's still success. And I'm at fault of this as well. You know, we strive for perfection, but we're dealing with imperfect human beings and imperfect systems that are inherently very complex. And so we've got to allow the leeway for our teams to hit some of those OKRs or the targets or whatever it might be, but also allow for kind of the human experience and the conversation and understanding of what's going on. I think also for me, from the big strategic piece down to the day to day, the other piece that kind of comes up is I often see organizations work with their strategic plan that's often not always grounded in as much data as I would maybe like. And then annual improvement plans or goals for the year are, again, they don't necessarily have a really solid baseline. And so then setting those really specific targets can be hard, and they can sometimes be plucked out of almost thin air. It's like, oh, well, it would be nice to improve this by 20%, or it would be nice to double this. And so I guess the important part for me is how do you get that really solid baseline data and then write really great targets or OKRs, whatever you're going to use or call them. But then also, how does that feed into your annual, say, or like into your performance reviews for your employees or your professional development and growth and learning plans for your employees? Because if they're all working on and focusing on different things that are not aligned with your targets and with your annual improvement goals and with then your strategic plan, we're just going to have kind of, it'd be like having ants running all over the shop and not knowing where they're going. Whereas if everybody is funneling upwards, and again, my brain's pretty black and white in this, but if they're all funneling up with their own annual specific kind of goals and targets into the team and then organization and into the strategic plan, then we're far more likely to be successful in what we're trying to achieve rather than having these lants going off in all different directions because something feels good and or they're interested in a particular thing. So they want to go and learn more about that.
Yeah. And I love thinking about it as the contribution towards the strategy rather than it being something that's balanced scorecard rolled down to the organization. Because I think you have a lot more buy-in when people can feel how they're contributing individually, but also collectively within their team to the overarching organization's goals. So, what are some of the traps or biases that leaders or teams often fall into when they're using data?
Confirmation bias, we hear, I feel like it's everywhere at the moment. We talk about it fairly often in your world and my world, that's for sure. And we look at data and we're likely to jump onto the first thing that proves the hypothesis that we have going into that analysis. So if we think that there's a specific trend or something is happening, we're likely to focus in on that first, which is really problematic when that's where our thinking stops. Just because we see something first doesn't mean that it's the most important. So for me, we've really got to be mindful of thinking really slowly. Like Daniel Kahneman in Thinking Fast and Slow talks about, that system two thinking is what we really want to be harnessing whenever we're doing any data analysis. Because what can happen is if we go in thinking fast and rapid in that system one, we can just latch onto the first thing that we see. We can make decisions about what we do, or we can excuse it away. And we've just wasted an amazing opportunity to potentially see something different that was going to be more valuable to us. So thinking in system two, rather than jumping into that confirmation bias, that's certainly one.
Can I just jump in for 1 second? So, how do people consciously shift into system two? Because you'll have people who are naturally very decisive and move on very quickly within a team or as an individual. And likewise, it's like, how do you create the space for people to shift into that system two thinking?
Yeah, so I literally template questions and inquiry for people. Like I particularly for people that don't have a lot of experience or skill, I literally template it like a worksheet. I want you to ask these questions. But also, we need people almost to get bored in the space. Like just let them for 10 to 15 minutes identify all of the things that they see in that data set and just make them like continue to look, because we can easily maybe come up with 5, 6 things if we're doing it quickly. But as I was saying before, like the best insight might actually come when you're looking more slowly and you're asking more questions. So it's creating the space to do that and also having multiple brains doing the analysis. So, if you don't see what I see in the data and I see something different, being able to riff off that and have that conversation, and then that will drop us into system two as well. For me, I feel like a real clunk. When I go into system two, I almost feel like a physical, like, oh yeah, okay, I'm here. And that's certainly what we should be aiming for.
Awesome. Now, I interrupted your flow. You were talking about some of the traps and biases. Is there anything else that you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think the other one attached to that is the action bias. So inherently, we want to do things, we want to act on it, we want to, whether that's good or bad, whether that's celebrating or whether it's giving somebody a bit of a kick, which is not great. I did have a senior leader say to me once that they were going to put a rocket up their staff the next day based on the data, which was not great. Because in that example, actually, he fell into the trap of confirmation bias And I didn't agree actually with the things that he'd seen. And I was able to look at it a bit more objectively because I'm outside the organization. But he then jumped straight to action. And his action was immediately like, right, I'm going to rip them tomorrow morning. I'm going to have one on ones with them. I'm going to do an audit of all of this stuff. And he went straight to action. And so there's an action bias as well that we fall into the trap of it. And what that means as well, the things that we go, okay, well, I'm going to go and do this is often the things that we've always done, like often the things we've done before. And so we actually need to double down on the system two thinking then at that point as well, because the actions we take don't have to be the same as the actions we've taken previously. They can be different, but we've got to be thinking slowly and having the time and space to think about that in order to identify maybe new solutions or different solutions or new options or opportunities. So, one of the things I do for that, like if you've identified that an insight you've found in the data is really super important and it's something that you need to do something about, you need to address it. I then have like a 3 by 3, almost like a little bingo grid. And I say to people, right, if that's the most important thing that's coming out of this data that you want to change, what are 9 ways in this 3 by 3 grid? What are 9 things we could do to address it? And again, it's like that system one brain will help us smash out maybe 4 or 5 answers or actions or solutions. And then we stop and go, oh, I don't know. And I make people sit in the discomfort of not being able to fill in the boxes and I don't let them move on until they have, because it forces them to then think like, well, what have I seen in my last job? Or what might this person recommend to me? What are some other possibilities? If I had more time to address this, what might I do? And so it's those prompting questions, but the framework as well. And it's ironic that a 3 by 3 framework grid actually encourages us to be more creative, but that's, yeah, it's wild. That's what it does, but it's really, really useful.
I guess it forces us to dig deeper. I think what I'm hearing is as a leader, asking good coaching questions to get people not just to go habitually with the first thing that they think and move on, but how do we actually dig deeper and dig deeper? And maybe that 3 by 3 matrix helps to do that.
Yeah, absolutely.
You've already given us some amazing ideas to help our teams have better data informed conversations from asking coaching questions. But is there any other tips or tools that you think would be useful for our listeners?
The other one that we haven't spoken much about, I think, is just visualizations. There is no one best visualization, and whatever dashboards you're using or platforms you're using, they're not always going to throw the data back to you in the way that you need it in terms of a visual. You could look at a bar chart or a line graph. You could look at box and whisker plots. You could look at a whole range of different visuals. If you want to communicate stories with impact, data stories with impact really well, you've got to choose the right visualizations. And that comes from knowing what your audience need, what the people in your team need to know, but also a good enough understanding of the visuals to really choose the best one. So they look at it and they just go, oh, yeah, that's absolutely something that we can get on board with and we can help with. Rather than we were talking earlier about dropping all these charts and stuff in front of people in a meeting. What we don't want is to give somebody a chart and for them to spend 10 minutes going, hang on, what's here and what does that mean? And they're trying to just read the actual visual. That's a major hurdle as well. So yeah, it's tricky. That takes time.
And I think that's probably quite common. I think a lot of leadership teams like, oh, so what's this? And get so caught up in what they're actually seeing, probably because they haven't read it beforehand and all those things, which could be questions before. So you can actually have the right conversation in the meeting too. Obviously, AI is the topic of every conversation at the moment. So how's AI changing how teams work with data?
Yeah, it's certainly helping. That's for sure. It's helping identify trends and potential insights in data sets. So, on dashboards, some dashboards and in some platforms now, there'll be flags to draw your attention to specific things. And that's pretty amazing. It's also really useful to do some of the analysis, even just for people with their own spreadsheets who can't get formulas right. ChatGPT, for example, is amazing at fixing formulas in Excel. You just drop in the broken formula and go, this is the error, and it just gives it back to you, which is pretty extraordinary. So it can help us visualize data, so create some of those really good charts. I recently was using ChatGPT to just say, this is the data I have, and these are some of the questions I have. What are some of the best ways I could visualize it? And so it gave me like 8 options and then it said, "Do you want me to visualize any of them?" And then it actually created the image for me, which was epic. And I was coaching some people about 3 weeks ago who are not Excel people at all, but they knew what they wanted and they just uploaded some information and they said, right, this is what I want. And this is the bar chart that I want to be able to show this decline over time. And it was amazing. They did ChatGPT could do it. The other part then is the actions. So, that system two thinking, going through that 3x3 grid of what we could do is useful. And I found real value in going to ChatGPT and saying, this is the problem I have. What are some possible actions for me, or what could I do to address this concern, or ways I could celebrate this amazing achievement or this thing that we've seen? And the good thing about ChatGPT is, and I always ask it to give me, say, 10 options. The good thing for me is that it will always come up with something I hadn't thought about. So there'll be a lot that I go, yeah, I thought about that. Oh, yeah, it's a bit different. There's always at least one that I go, yeah, that's actually a really good idea. And it wasn't on my radar. It's just, I think it's really helping us think outside the box in analysis, in visualization, and in helping us determine actions.
Yeah. I think using it as a thought partner is what I'm hearing is such a useful tool, but also helping us ensure that our data is correct with the right formulas and other kind of techniques as well. If our listeners were going to make one shift in terms of creating a more data informed team, what's that one shift that you think would be most important for them to focus on?
You've got to start talking about the data. Like, if you want it to be a priority, you've got to start talking about it. You've got to model it to your people. And if you're not 100% confident yourself, that's okay. Nobody expects you to be the gun who has all the answers to all the questions. You've got to lean into the vulnerability of not knowing everything. Yeah, I think the best leader I ever saw do that, she introduced me. I was running a workshop with her team and she introduced me. At the end of the introduction, she said, and as you guys know, I'm not great with data. So I'm going to sit with this smaller group over here. I'm going to be learning alongside you guys because we all need to get better at this. And it's such a powerful message for the team. And they did amazing work that day.
I love the vulnerability, but it also creates a platform for learning for everybody, including the leader, which is really important, especially if it's a new skill that the team might not be comfortable with in terms of data. So, Selena, if you could leave our listeners with one message about thriving teams, what would it be?
Thriving teams from a data perspective are collaborative. Nobody has all the answers. Nobody can see all the most important things. It's about multiple brains, multiple people working together to get the best out of the numbers and the data for the people that they're aiming to serve.
I love it. Thank you so much, Selena. I've taken lots of notes and looking forward to listening back because there's lots of tools and tips that our listeners will take advantage of, but also personally for me as well. So thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. So I hope you enjoyed the episode with Selena Fisk as much as I did. I particularly enjoyed understanding some of our conformity bias and action bias that we might hold. As someone who's very fast paced, I probably move to action quite quickly. So how can we ask some deeper what or how questions of our team to really understand what the data is telling us so we can make data informed decisions? I also love the fact that we need to look at multiple data sources, whether that's qualitative or quantitative, so we take a holistic perspective and also bring in different ideas, perceptions, backgrounds, and experiences of people within the team so we can collaborate to make a better decision as a team. So I challenge you to reflect on how are you using data to inform the decisions that you make as an individual, but within your team? And how can you help build that data literacy, storytelling, so that you can make better data-informed decisions? Thanks for listening. Thanks for joining us at the Thriving Leaders podcast. If you'd like to find out more about our leadership programs, including our Thriving Leaders program, Thriving Women in Leadership and Thriving Teams, as well as executive and team coaching, keynote speaking or facilitation, head to our website, www.thrivingculture.com.au. This is also where you can sign up for our newsletter, where I share useful leadership and team development insights and tools, as well as our podcast. You can also grab your copy of my book, Thriving Leaders, Learn the Skills to Lead Confidently. It's also available at all good online retailers on Audible, Spotify and Kindle. If you like this episode, I'd be so grateful if you left a 5-star review, as it helps us reach more people and therefore helps more leaders thrive.